It was just another quiet afternoon in Whispering Pines, a sleepy town cradled between pine forests and winding rivers, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, but no one really knew your secrets. The air smelled of wet earth, and the golden sunlight filtered through tall branches, dappling the ground in a patchwork of warm light and creeping shadows. And then there was the sandal. A single pink sandal, no bigger than a child's hand, bobbing in the river's slow current like a forgotten toy. It twisted and turned with the water, a plastic flower on the strap catching the light as it spun over and over. It should have been a small thing, an ordinary thing. But somehow it wasn't. It was the kind of thing that made your stomach sink, even before your brain caught up. The river ran slow that day, almost lazy, but beneath the surface it hid a dark and steady pull. Just downstream, where the old wooden bridge creaked under the weight of years, an old German shepherd named Ranger lifted his head. Ranger wasn't just any dog. He was a retired K9, once part of the county sheriff's unit, a legend in his day, for sniffing out what others missed, drugs, missing kids, and sometimes the kind of evil that wore a friendly face. But now Ranger was old, his fur grayed around the muzzle, his eyes cloudy, and his hips stiff from too many chases and not enough thanks. He should have been sleeping, maybe dreaming of the good old days. But that afternoon, something stirred in him. A scent on the wind, sharp as rusted nails and just as cold. His ears perked, trembling slightly. And then the scream. It wasn't loud, more like a stifled yelp, barely a whisper above the rustling leaves. But Ranger heard it, and he moved. In the woods, a girl no older than 8 lay crumpled on the riverbank. Her name was Emma Carter, and she had dark hair tangled with twigs, a blue t-shirt soaked through with mud, and a scrape on her forehead that oozed a thin line of blood. Her shoes were missing, her face was pale, her breath barely a flicker. Nobody saw the man in the black boots. Nobody saw the way he shoved her, the way she hit her head on the smooth, mossy stone, or how she slipped beneath the water like a discarded doll. Nobody except Ranger. He barreled through the underbrush, old muscles stretching in a way they hadn't in years. His paws slammed against the soft earth, each stride fueled by something deeper than instinct, by the memory of loss, by the echo of a past he couldn't forget. The river wasn't just water that day. It was a thief, a silent taker of things, too small to fight back. Emma floated face down, her hair fanning out like dark seaweed. Ranger plunged in, the cold cutting deep, but he didn't hesitate. He bit down on her shirt and tugged, hard. The current fought him, tugging her away, but he growled into the water, a low, furious sound like a warning to death itself. And then, slowly, she emerged, limp, fragile, heavy with the weight of water and secrets. At that exact moment, Mrs. Helen Adams, the town's unofficial grandma, was cutting up green beans in her kitchen. Her window overlooked the river, and she'd like to say she'd seen more truth out that window than most people read in the papers. When she heard Ranger's bark, a sound she hadn't heard in years, her hands froze, and the knife clattered to the floor. It wasn't just a bark, it was the bark. The same one he'd made the night he found a missing boy in the woods years ago. She ran, no cane, no shoes, just raw fear, and a prayer on her lips. Down by the river, Ranger nudged Emma's body with his nose whining low, his tail a stiff flag behind him. Helen dropped to her knees, pressing trembling fingers to the girl's neck. There, faint, but there, a pulse. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. The paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, red lights swirling through the trees, sirens howling across the quiet town. A young paramedic named Jason frowned as he looked at the mud-caked dog beside the gurney. "Who's this?" he asked. Helen's voice was steady, her old eyes sharp. "He's not just a dog, he's a witness." Ranger stood silent, his wet, fur spiked and heavy, his eyes locked on Emma like he'd been waiting for her all his life. As they lifted Emma into the ambulance, the air seemed to hold its breath. Halfway to the hospital, Ranger tried to jump in the back, but Jason blocked him. "No dogs," he said firmly. Helen's voice cut in, fierce as a blade. Let him in. That dog's part of this story whether you like it or not. Jason hesitated. And in that moment I want to pause and remind you. If you're touched by stories of loyal dogs like Ranger, and if you believe in the silent heroes who fight for those without a voice, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Heroes for Animals, for more stories that will move your heart and open your eyes. Back in the hospital, Dr. Mike Langley, a man who'd seen his share of tragedies, peeled back the girl's shirt to check her injuries. What he saw made him freeze. Bruises, not just from the river. Old ones, fading but still there like fingerprints from a past that refused to stay hidden. This isn't just a fall, he muttered under his breath. Nurse Amanda Parker bit her lip, exchanging a glance with the doctor, her eyes wide and worried. In the waiting room, Ranger lay down in front of the door, his body a wall of silent protection. People passed by, casting glances at the dirty, aging dog, but nobody dared tell him to move. Outside the hospital, a man in a white shirt and polished boots, Elijah Carter, lit a cigarette with hands that didn't quite stop shaking. His eyes flicked toward the hospital windows, cold as winter rain. She's always been a clumsy kid, he muttered to no one in particular, his voice smooth, too smooth. Ranger's ears twitched, his nose lifted to the wind, and somewhere, deep, in the dark, the scent of fear drifted like smoke. The river had taken a child, or maybe it was something much worse. Ranger didn't know everything, but he knew enough, and he wasn't going anywhere. The hospital waiting room smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, a place where time seemed to stretch and contract with every beep of a monitor down the hall. Ranger lay on the cold tile floor, paws outstretched, head between them, eyes half closed but always watching. His ears twitched every time the door creaked open, but his gaze never drifted far from the hallway where Emma Carter was fighting for her life. Sylvia Reynolds, the town's social worker, stepped into the hospital with a notebook tucked under her arm, her hair pulled back in a tight bun that had started to fray from the long day. She paused when she saw Ranger sprawled by the entrance, muddy, tired but alert. For a second, she just looked at him like the pieces of a puzzle were waiting to click into place. "You're the one they're talking about, huh?" she whispered, bending down to scratch gently behind his ears. Ranger didn't move, but a faint thump of his tail brushed against the floor. Elijah Carter was in the corner of the waiting room, seated in a plastic chair, his posture too relaxed, like he was trying too hard to look concerned. He sipped slowly from a styrofoam cup of coffee, his boots tapping a rhythm on the floor that didn't match the urgency of the situation. His eyes flicked up as Sylvia approached. "Mr. Carter," she began, flipping open her notebook. "Can I ask you a few questions about what happened today?" He gave her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a practiced, measured smile, the kind that worked on teachers and store clerks, maybe even the occasional sheriff's deputy. "Of course. Happy to help." Sylvia clicked her pen, her fingers. "Steady? You said Emma fell into the river while you were out walking?" "That's right," Elijah said smoothly. "She's always been a curious one. Likes to wander off. Slipped on the rocks, I guess. Next thing I know, she's in the water." Ranger's ears perked up. His eyes, half-lidded, locked onto Elijah with a quiet intensity, and his lip curled just slightly, a twitch that lasted less than a heartbeat. Sylvia noticed. "Funny thing," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Emma's 8. The rocks are slick down there. I've walked that trail myself and I know it can be dangerous. But you didn't mention being down by the river earlier when the sheriff first spoke to you." Elijah's smile twitched. "Guess I didn't think it mattered. Just trying to get her help, you know?" His tone was smooth, but there was a flicker of something underneath. Annoyance, maybe. Or fear. Sylvia nodded slowly, jotting down a note. She could feel Ranger's gaze beside her, like the dog was trying to tell her something in the only way he knew how. Meanwhile, in the ER, Dr. Mike Langley was examining Emma. He frowned as he traced the bruises along her spine, faint but distinct, like fingerprints pressed into her skin. He'd seen this pattern before, not from a fall, not from a slip into the river. These were the kind of marks that came from something or someone grabbing, holding too tight. squeezing where they shouldn't. Amanda, the nurse, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Doctor, you see this?" "I see it," he muttered, his jaw tight. But outside the exam room there was no proof, no witness, just an old dog and a river that wouldn't talk. When Emma was finally stable, they moved her to a room with pale yellow walls and a single window that overlooked the parking lot. Sylvia stood quietly by the doorway, her eyes on the little girl who lay so still, her small chest rising and falling like the flutter of a paper kite. Ranger sat just outside the door, his head resting on his paws, a silent sentinel. The next morning, Sylvia returned to the hospital. Ranger was still there, as if he hadn't left all night. A small stack of paperwork waited on her desk, mandatory forms, incident reports, the usual red tape. But what caught her eye was a drawing, tucked between the files like it had been left there for her to find. A child's drawing, a stick figure girl with dark hair, a big dog beside her and, just barely visible, a tall figure wearing black boots standing near a river. Her stomach flipped. She flipped the paper over, searching for a name, but there was nothing. "Hey, Sylvia," a voice called from behind. It was Helen Adams, the elderly neighbor who'd called 911. Her eyes were puffy, her hands clutching a cup of tea. "That dog," she said, pointing at Ranger. "He didn't just find her. He knew something was wrong. He wouldn't stop barking, not until we found her." Sylvia nodded slowly, her mind racing. In a small town like Whispering Pines, people talked, but they also looked away when things got uncomfortable. Ranger wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a question no one wanted to answer. That night, Sylvia sat at her kitchen table, staring at the file in front of her. She sipped coffee that had gone cold, the taste bitter on her tongue. Her fingers hovered over her phone, the urge to call the sheriff, warring with the fear that it wouldn't matter. Then she looked at Ranger, lying on the rug, his breathing slow, his eyes half closed but never fully asleep. She whispered into the dim light, not expecting an answer. "Do you know, old boy? Do you know what happened out there?" Ranger lifted his head, just barely, and the way his eyes glinted in the low light. It wasn't human, but it wasn't just a dog's gaze either. It was the look of someone who had seen, who had witnessed, and who was waiting for someone to finally listen. Across town, Elijah Carter poured himself a whiskey and sat on the porch, the night air cool against his skin. He stared at the trees, his jaw tight. In his hand he clenched a small pink hair tie. Outside, in the dark, a shape moved among the trees, and in the quiet, a low, steady growl rumbled. Ranger hadn't forgotten. The morning sun barely touched the tops of the pine trees when Sylvia Reynolds pulled into the parking lot of Whispering Pines Elementary. The sky was pale, streaked with gray clouds, and the air smelled like wet grass and something unspoken, hanging heavy. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, staring at the front doors where a line of kids were filing in, their backpacks bouncing, their shoes squeaking on the polished linoleum. Most of them moved in a blur of noise and energy, but a few, just a few, moved differently. Quiet, careful, watchful. Sylvia had seen it before. Ranger sat beside her in the passenger seat, his head low, eyes locked on the school entrance. His fur bristled every time Elijah Carter's truck came into view. The man had shown up this morning with a box of donuts in one hand and a fake smile in the other, waving at teachers like he was the poster boy for small-town charm. But Ranger wasn't fooled. Neither was Sylvia. She stepped out of the car, pulling her cardigan tight around her shoulders as a cold breeze swept through. Ranger jumped down too, landing heavier than he used to, his joints stiff but determined. Inside the school, Mrs. Vega, the art teacher, greeted Sylvia with a worried look. "Morning," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "Got a minute?" Sylvia asked. Mrs. Vega nodded. They ducked into the empty art room. The walls were covered with children's drawings, bright suns, stick figures, houses with crooked chimneys. But mixed in, almost hidden, were pictures that didn't belong. A man in black boots, a girl with a blue shirt, a dog standing by a river. Mrs. Vega's voice was barely above a breath. Leo drew this yesterday. She pointed to a paper tucked under a stack of construction paper. A shaky sketch, crude but unmistakable. A man pushing something into the water, a girl's arms flailing, and in the corner a dark shape with ears pointed standing rigid by the river's edge. "That's Emma," Sylvia whispered, her throat tightening. Mrs. Vega nodded, her eyes glossy. "And that's Ranger." Before Sylvia could respond, the intercom crackled. "Elijah Carter, please report to the office." Ranger's ears snapped up. His body tensed, muscles tight beneath his fur. Sylvia felt it too, that electric snap in the air like a storm about to break. In the hallway, Elijah's boots echoed louder than they should have, sharp and steady, like a metronome marking the beat of something dark. He passed by the art room, paused. His eyes slid to Sylvia, then to Mrs. Vega, then, just for a second, to Ranger. "Ladies," he drawled, his voice smooth as honey but sharp as a knife. "Working hard, I see." Sylvia felt her pulse spike. She forced her voice steady. "Just reviewing some student projects." Elijah's gaze lingered on the drawings pinned to the wall. A flicker of something crossed his face. Recognition, maybe. Or calculation. Then he smiled, a slow, curling grin that didn't touch his eyes. "Well, carry on," he said, and kept walking. Ranger's low growl followed him down the hallway like a shadow. That night, Sylvia sat in her kitchen, flipping through her notebook. Names, dates, sketches. The patterns were forming, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. She stared at the page where she'd scribbled Leo's drawing, Emma's bruises, Ranger's reaction. She closed her eyes. The sound of a truck door slamming snapped her out of it. She peeked through the curtains. Elijah Carter stood outside his house across the street, pacing under the porch light. He had a cigarette clenched between his teeth, the smoke curling around his face like a mask. Ranger, lying by the door, growled low, deep in his chest. Sylvia's breath caught. "He knows," she whispered, barely a sound. The next morning at the hospital, Emma stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, her small fingers twitching like they were reaching for something. Sylvia was there, notebook in hand, waiting. Dr. Langley nodded at her, his face a mix of hope and worry. Emma's voice was a dry whisper, barely audible. "Tajo," she breathed, her eyes glassy but searching. Sylvia blinked. "Who's Tajo, honey?" Emma's lips trembled. "The dog. The dog at the river. Ranger." Sylvia's heart thumped so hard it hurt. She leaned in gently. "Emma, can you tell me who hurt you?" Emma's eyes fluttered closed again, but her hand moved, gripping the sheet. Her small fingers traced something invisible, 2 lines, then a curve, then a dot. Sylvia understood. Boots, black boots. Later that day, Sylvia went back to Whispering Pines Elementary. She sat with Leo in the art room, her voice soft, her posture relaxed. "Leo, can you tell me what you saw?" Leo didn't speak. He never did. But he opened his sketchbook. Page after page of drawings. Boots, a river, a dog, a man's face drawn, over and over, always the same hollow eyes and the shadow of a cigarette in his mouth. Sylvia's hands shook as she flipped through them. Ranger sat by her feet, watching the boy with a quiet, unwavering gaze. Leo looked down at Ranger. His lips moved, just barely. "He was there," he whispered. "The dog saw." Sylvia froze. "What did the dog see, Leo?" Leo looked up, his eyes dark and serious. He saw what they did to Emma. That night, Ranger sat by the door again, his body still, his eyes fixed on the shadows outside. Elijah Carter's truck idled on the street, the headlights cutting across the lawn like searchlights. He didn't get out. Just sat there smoking, staring. Ranger growled. A deep bone-shaking sound that rolled through the quiet like a storm warning. Sylvia stood behind him, her hand resting on his head, feeling the tension coiled beneath the fur. "We're getting close, boy," she whispered. Ranger's ears flicked outside. Elijah's cigarette flared bright, then dropped to the ground, a tiny red dot fading into the night. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something like smoke and old secrets. And in the dark, Ranger didn't move. The wind had picked up overnight, rattling the windows and bending the trees outside Sylvia's house. By morning, the air smelled sharp, like pine needles crushed under boots, like secrets buried in damp earth. Sylvia sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold between her hands. Ranger lay by the door, his head on his paws, eyes half closed, but twitching at every sound. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that hummed with things left unsaid. Sylvia glanced at her notes, flipping through pages of names, times, and sketches. The edges were worn, smudged by her fingers, and the words felt heavier each time she read them. Emma, Leo, black boots, the river, Ranger. A soft knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Mrs. Vega stood on the porch holding a folder tight to her chest. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Can I come in?" she asked. Sylvia nodded, stepping aside. They sat together, neither speaking at first. The folder sat between them like a weight. Ranger shifted, his tail tapping once against the floor before settling. Mrs. Vega finally spoke, her voice low. "I need you to see these." She opened the folder, revealing a stack of drawings, more than Sylvia expected. Each one was similar. A tall figure with dark boots, a child, a river, and always, the dog. Sylvia's breath caught. Who drew these? Mrs. Vega hesitated. Different kids, not just Leo. There's Sophia, Jessie, even little Mia in second grade. They've all drawn some version of the same thing. Sylvia felt the chill rise in her chest, a cold thread winding tight. "It's not just Emma," she whispered. Mrs. Vega shook her head, her fingers trembling as she flipped to the last page, a drawing of Ranger, standing at the edge of the water, barking at a shadow with no face. Sylvia closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deep. When she opened them, Ranger was watching her, his gaze steady and sharp, as if waiting for her to catch up. She ran her hand through her hair. "This isn't just a coincidence." "No," Mrs. Vega said quietly. "It's not." Just then, Sylvia's phone buzzed. It was a message from the sheriff's office, one of those generic updates sent out to community leaders. But the wording made her freeze. "Elijah Carter has been cleared of all suspicion in the Carter case. Case officially closed. No further action required." Sylvia's hands tightened around the phone, her knuckles turning white. Mrs. Vega stared at her. "They're closing it?" Sylvia nodded, her voice low and tight. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She stood abruptly, pacing the room. Ranger rose too, stretching stiff legs, his tail low. Mrs. Vega hesitated. "Sylvia, what are you going to do?" Sylvia's voice was soft, but her eyes burned. "I'm going to listen. To them. To the kids. And to him." She nodded toward Ranger. That evening, Sylvia sat in her car outside Elijah Carter's house. The porch light was off, but a faint glow seeped through the curtains. His truck was parked at an angle in the driveway, the front left tire on the grass like he hadn't cared to park straight. Sylvia's heart pounded. She watched the shadows in the windows, her fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the steering. Wheel Ranger sat in the back seat, silent but alert. His ears pricked forward, his body tense, ready. And then it happened. The door creaked open, and Elijah stepped out. He was wearing a jacket over a flannel shirt, the same black boots as always. He looked around, his head jerking slightly like a man checking if the coast was clear. But Ranger was already on his feet, growling low, the sound vibrating through the car. Sylvia's breath caught. She opened the door slowly, careful not to slam. The Ranger leapt out first, hitting the ground with a thud, his body a dark shadow against the porch light. Elijah froze. For a split second, the two locked eyes, man and dog, predator and protector. Elijah's expression twisted, a flash of something feral and mean flickering across his face. "You," he muttered, almost to himself. Ranger growled deeper, his teeth bared, a sound that felt ancient, like it had been passed down through generations of dogs who knew how to guard, how to warn, how to fight. Sylvia stepped forward, her voice steady but low. I know about the drawings, Elijah. I know about the bruises. I know you were at the river. Elijah's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. You're stirring up trouble where there isn't any, he hissed. Ranger took a step closer, the growl rising. Elijah, I'm not the one you should be worried about, Sylvia said quietly. Ranger lunged, not at Elijah, but past him, to the side yard where the fence sagged. His nose pressed to the ground, snuffling, tail stiff, body rigid. Sylvia followed, her heart racing. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small pink hair tie, the same color Emma had worn the day she was found. Sylvia's breath caught in her throat. Ranger nudged it, then looked up at her, his eyes saying everything. Elijah's voice snapped behind them, sharp as a whip. Get off my property. Sylvia turned slowly, her fingers curling around the hair tie. Elijah, she said, her voice calm but deadly. The kids aren't lying, and neither is this dog. Elijah's face contorted, a flash of rage crossing his features before he masked it with a tight fake smile. Get out, Sylvia. Before you make a mistake you can't take back. Sylvia backed away slowly, her hand on Ranger's back. He didn't take his eyes off Elijah, not for a second. Back at home, Sylvia sat, in the dark, the hair tie on the table in front of her. Ranger lay at her feet, quiet but alert. She picked up the hair tie, turning it over in her hands, the weight of it heavier than it should be. Her phone buzzed, a message from Leo's mother. He drew something new tonight. Sylvia's heart clenched. She opened the photo attachment. It was a sketch, Emma standing by the river, a man in boots, and Ranger barking at him. But this time there was something else. A hand reaching out from the shadows. Another child, another secret waiting to be told. Ranger stirred, lifting his head, ears pricked, and outside the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of a bark that refused to be silenced. The wind outside Sylvia's house had quieted, but the storm inside her chest was only getting stronger. The small pink hair tie lay on her kitchen table, its threads frayed, its color faded from sunlight and time. It wasn't just a hair tie anymore. It was a thread, a connection between Emma, the other kids, and the dark truth she could feel pulsing just beneath the surface of Whispering Pines. Ranger lay curled at Sylvia's feet, his breathing slow, but his eyes sharp, always sharp. Every so often his ears twitched at some noise only he could hear, a creak in the floorboards, a branch brushing the window, the distant growl of a pickup truck's engine revving in the night. The photo Leo's mom had sent still glowed on Sylvia's phone screen, a simple drawing, but it hit harder than any police report ever could. Emma by the river, a man with boots, another child hidden in the shadows, and Ranger, barking with all his might. It wasn't just Emma. There were more. The next morning, Sylvia walked into the sheriff's office with Ranger at her side. The receptionist, a young woman named Carly, looked up from her desk, startled. You can't have a dog in here, ma'am, she said, eyes wide. Sylvia didn't flinch. He's a witness, she said simply. Sheriff Tom Weller leaned back in his chair when Sylvia entered his office, arms crossed over his chest, his badge glinting in the light. What's this about, Sylvia? He asked, his voice a mix of weariness and warning. Sylvia set the hair tie down on his desk. This was buried in Elijah Carter's yard. The kids' drawings match, Emma's bruises, Leo's sketches, Ranger's behavior. You know there's something going on here. Tom rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. Sylvia, you're chasing shadows. We can't build a case on a dog's bark and a child's crayon drawing. Sylvia's voice was calm, but her eyes burned. No, Tom, you're not building a case because you don't want to, because Elijah Carter's been part of this town forever, and it's easier to believe kids are making things up than to admit the man who waves at you from his porch might be the one hurting them. Ranger growled low, his eyes fixed on the sheriff like he could see the hesitation behind the badge. Tom shifted uncomfortably. I can't. Yes, you can, Sylvia cut in. You can reopen the file. You can look at those kids, you can talk to them, you can look at this hair tie and ask why it's in his yard. or you can keep pretending the river washed it all away. The silence in the room was thick, the kind that buzzed in your ears. Finally, Tom sighed, running a hand down his face. I'll see what I can do. That afternoon, Sylvia stopped by the elementary school again. Mrs. Vega met her in the hallway, her face pale, her voice hushed. He's here, she whispered. Elijah? Mrs. Vega nodded, her hands shaking. He's picking up Jesse early. Said it's a family matter. Sylvia's heart dropped into her stomach. She turned, moving fast down the hall, Ranger trotting close at her side. They reached the front office just as Elijah was signing the clipboard, Jesse standing beside him, clutching his backpack like a lifeline. Elijah, Sylvia said, her voice sharp. He looked up, his smile tight. Sylvia, didn't expect to see you here. Ranger let out a low, steady growl, his hackles raised, his eyes locked onto Elijah like a predator sizing up a threat. Jesse, Sylvia said gently, kneeling down. Hey, buddy, you okay? Jesse wouldn't meet her eyes. His fingers tightened. On the strap of his bag, his knuckles white. Elijah's voice cut in, smooth as always. We're fine, Sylvia. Just a family thing. Not your business. But Ranger wasn't fooled. He stepped closer, his nose twitching, his body coiled like a loaded spring. Elijah, Sylvia said quietly, you need to let Jesse go. The office had fallen silent. Even Carly, behind the desk, had stopped typing. Elijah's jaw tightened. You're overstepping. And then it happened. Fast. Too fast. Jesse flinched, a small, barely there movement, but Ranger saw it. He lunged, not at Elijah, at the bag Jesse was holding. His teeth clamped down on the zipper, tugging, growling, pulling it open with a force that seemed impossible for an old dog. Jesse stumbled back, wide-eyed, as Ranger tore the bag open. And out tumbled a small, dirty notebook, pages crumpled, the cover stained with something dark. Sylvia grabbed it, flipping it open. The first page was a drawing. Jesse, a figure with boots, a river. The next page, another child, a girl Sylvia didn't recognize. And then another. Dozens of pages, dozens of kids. The office erupted in voices. Mrs. Vega gasping, Carly standing, Jesse crying softly, Elijah's voice rising in protest, his face red and twisted. Enough. Tom's voice thundered from the doorway. He'd come in unseen, but he was here now, his face pale as he took in the scene. Sylvia looked up, her voice steady. This is what you missed, Tom. What we all missed. Ranger stood by her side, his body still, his eyes sharp. Tom swallowed hard, his jaw tight. Elijah Carter, you're coming with me. Elijah protested, his voice a venomous hiss, but Tom was already cuffing him, reading him his rights. Sylvia knelt in front of Jesse, her voice soft. It's okay, Jesse. You're safe now. Ranger licked the boy's hand gently, and for the first time, Jesse met Sylvia's eyes, a tear sliding down his cheek. The silence had broken. Later that night, Sylvia sat at her kitchen table, the notebook open in front of her. Ranger lay at her feet, his breathing slow, his body relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. She traced the drawings with her fingers, feeling the weight of each line, each shape, each story told in a child's quiet way. She knew it wasn't over. Not yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. Ranger lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. Good boy, she whispered. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the dark, the river ran slow, carrying away the weight of too many secrets as the town of Whispering Pines exhaled. It was a quiet morning in Whispering Pines, the kind that felt like the world had taken a deep breath and held it. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the river hummed its slow, steady song, as if the earth itself had been waiting for this moment. At Sylvia's kitchen table, the notebook Jesse had clutched like a shield lay open. Page after page, drawings, small hands pressing hard on the crayons, shaping the truth in ways they couldn't say out loud. A figure with boots, a river, a dog, and always The dog. Ranger lay nearby, his body still but alert, his ears twitching at every shift of wind. Outside, his eyes were half closed, but his breathing, steady, deep, felt like a quiet drumbeat, a promise. Sylvia knew this wasn't over, but the pieces had finally started to fit. The sheriff had Elijah Carter in custody, and Tom had promised to push the investigation further this time. The notebook, the drawings, the bruises, the hair tie, all of it was adding up to something too big to ignore. And yet, even with Elijah gone, the weight in Sylvia's chest hadn't lifted. Not yet. That afternoon, she visited the hospital. Emma was sitting up now, propped against pillows, her small hands folded in her lap. She looked out the window, watching the autumn leaves drift down like feathers. Sylvia knocked gently before entering, and Emma turned her head, her eyes soft but still shadowed. "Hi, Emma," Sylvia said, sitting beside her. "Hi." They sat, in quiet for a long moment, the hum of machines and the distant footsteps of nurses filling the space between them. "Do you remember the dog who found you?" Sylvia asked softly. Emma's lips curved into the smallest smile. "Ranger," she whispered. Sylvia nodded. "He's been looking out for you. For a lot of kids, I think." Emma's eyes grew wide, and she nodded slowly. I think he hears things people don't," she said, her voice barely a breath. Sylvia swallowed, her throat tight. "I think you're right." That evening, back at home, Sylvia sat on the porch, Ranger resting at her feet. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. The town felt different. Not fixed, not whole, but maybe, just maybe, a little less broken. Mrs. Vega stopped by, carrying a casserole dish and a bottle of sweet tea. She sat down beside Sylvia, letting out a tired sigh. "We did something good, didn't we?" she asked, her voice hopeful but worn. Sylvia nodded slowly. "We started something. The rest is going to take time." Ranger lifted his head, his eyes scanning the street as if still watching, still guarding. A few days later at the town hall meeting, the community gathered. Parents, teachers, kids. The sheriff spoke, his voice steady as he shared the details of the case, the arrests, the evidence, the silent stories told through drawings. Sylvia stood too, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She told them what she'd seen, what the kids had told her, what the dog had shown them. She told them about Emma, about Leo, about the notebook that had been hidden for too long, and she told them about Ranger. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket when you're finally ready to listen. Then, a small voice broke the silence. "I drew the man too," a little girl said, standing by her mother's side, her voice shaking. Another boy raised his hand, and another dozens of small voices, each carrying a piece of the story that had been buried. Sylvia felt her chest tighten, her eyes stinging. This was what it meant to be heard. After the meeting, Ranger lay at the edge of the stage, watching the kids as they trickled out, some stopping to pet him, their small hands brushing over his fur like a thank you they didn't have words for. Later that night, Sylvia sat in her living room, the quiet now feeling like a friend instead of an enemy. Ranger was curled up by the fire, his breathing soft, his body relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months. She reached down and scratched behind his ears, her voice barely a whisper. "You did good, old boy. You did real good." Ranger opened, one eye, his tail thumping once against the floor. The next morning, a small ceremony was held at the riverbank, the place where it all began. The townsfolk gathered, holding candles, some in tears, some holding each other's hands. Sylvia stood at the front, a simple stone in her hand. She knelt by the water's edge and placed the stone in the dirt. It was smooth, simple, but the words etched into it held the weight of the whole town's silence breaking. Here barked the truth no one else dared to say. The kids placed flowers, wild daisies, dandelions, small scraps of paper with their names. And when the last person had gone, Sylvia and Ranger stayed. They sat in the quiet, the wind in the trees, the soft lap of water against the shore. Sylvia leaned her head back, watching the clouds drift by, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself breathe deep. She reached down, resting her hand on Ranger's back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath slow and steady. "Thank you," she whispered, not just to him but to the kids, to the town, and maybe even to the river itself. Ranger didn't move, but she felt the warmth of him beside her, the quiet strength that had carried them through. And so the town of Whispering Pines carried on. The river still ran, the trees still whispered, and the kids were finally heard. And somewhere in the quiet moments when the wind shifted just right, you could still hear it. A low, steady bark, a promise that no matter what, someone would always be listening. Thank you for following this story of courage, truth, and the loyalty of a dog who never stopped fighting for what was right. Before you go, let me ask you, have you ever felt like your voice didn't matter until someone or something reminded you that it did? Let's remember that every voice counts, even the smallest ones.